They say some places are better left forgotten. Some houses aren't just haunted, they're wrong, like they were never supposed to be built in the first place. Let me take you to the edge of nowhere. A small town in Maine, buried in fog and silence. A town where people don't talk much, especially about the house at the end of Ashwood Lane. A house that doesn't show up on maps. A house that no one admits they've seen, even though its silhouette stands dark against the trees. This is the story of the house that shouldn't exist, and what happened to the last person who walked through its door. Her name was Evelyn Moore, a travel writer, skeptic, and self-proclaimed explorer of the unexplained. She wasn't the type to be scared off by old legends or blurry photos. In fact, she made her career debunking haunted locations for clicks and ad revenue. So when she heard whispers about a phantom house in an obscure Reddit thread, a house with no foundation, no history, no records, she was intrigued. Naturally, she packed a camera, a voice recorder, and a flashlight, and she drove. The town she arrived in, population maybe 200, didn't appear on her GPS. She had to follow paper directions, the kind scrawled in pen by some anonymous internet user. The fog grew thicker as she approached, almost unnaturally so, and her cell service dropped the moment she crossed the town line. Classic horror movie stuff, she thought with a smirk. She asked a gas station clerk about Ashwood Lane. The man, maybe in his 60s, with sunken eyes and skin like crumpled paper, paused, then said, "Ain't no road by that name here, but I've got directions," she began. He cut her off. "Then follow him, but don't expect help if your car breaks down." He turned away without another word. Most people would take that as a warning. Evelyn took it as confirmation. The legend was real. She followed the directions. Ashwood Lane wasn't on any street signs. It was a dirt path swallowed by trees, more like a logging trail than a road. Her tires crunched over gravel and dead leaves. The trees on either side were so dense they looked like a wall, closing in behind her. A house, not decayed, not ancient, but strange. Too symmetrical. No driveway, no mailbox, no visible foundation. Just a black two-story structure sitting perfectly centered in a clearing that felt wrong, like the trees had bent away from it. Evelyn parked and stepped out. No birds, no wind, just silence. She raised her camera. The lens glitched. Once, twice, before the screen went black. She tried her phone. Also dead still. She pressed on. She wasn't about to turn back now. The porch creaked under her boots. The front door wasn't locked. It opened with a hiss, like something exhaling. Inside, the house was pristine, almost sterile. Everything was too clean, too still. The walls were an off-white. The furniture basic and untouched. No dust, no smell, no sound. But what struck her most was that there were no windows, not a single one. And yet, the place was dimly lit, as if by some invisible, artificial sun. That's when she heard it, a soft creaking, upstairs. Evelyn froze. She was sure she was alone. She called out, "Hello, I'm not here to steal anything." Just documenting. No response. Another creak. Then, footsteps. Slow. Precise. Coming from the top of the stairs. Her instinct screamed at her to leave. But Evelyn was too deep in the moment. She started recording audio if her camera wouldn't work. Maybe her recorder would. She climbed the staircase, every step groaning like it hadn't been touched in decades. At the top, the hallway stretched far longer than the outside of the house should allow. That's when she realized the house was bigger on the inside. Impossibly so. Doors lined both sides of the hallway. Maybe 10, maybe 12. All identical. All closed, except one, slightly ajar. A thin strip of flickering yellow light bled out into the hall. Evelyn walked toward it, her recorder trembling in her hand, her breath now visible, though the air wasn't cold. Something was wrong, fundamentally wrong. She reached the door. Inside, there was nothing but a chair, facing the wall, and a mirror not mounted but standing on its own. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. The light went out. Pitch black. Then a whisper right behind her ear. "Welcome back, Evelyn." Her blood ran cold. She turned but saw only the mirror, and in it, not her reflection. A version of her but not her. Same face, same eyes, but smiling. Eyes hollow, mouth twitching unnaturally. Then the mirror cracked, just a hairline fracture. She stumbled back, fumbled for the door, but the handle was gone. The walls began to pulse, like they were breathing, and from the corner, the chair creaked, as if someone, or something, had just sat down. Evelyn screamed, but no sound came out. Her recorder clicked off. For years there had been whispers of a village deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania that no longer existed on any map. Not because it was never real, but because it had been erased deliberately and for reasons cloaked in horror. This village was called Valmer, and its disappearance is one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in Eastern Europe. Locals from nearby towns claim that Valmer was once a quiet, isolated settlement nestled between thick pine forests and steep mist-covered cliffs. The population was small, never more than 300 people. They lived off the land, relied on ancient traditions, and seemed to avoid all forms of modernization. There were no roads that led directly to the village. If you wanted to find it, you had to hike several hours through uneven terrain, guided only by memory and instinct. But in the autumn of 1986, something happened. One morning, a hunter named Georgi, who frequently passed through the forest near noticed an unnatural silence in the air. No birds, no wind, no distant echoes of village life, just an eerie, suffocating stillness. Curious and concerned, he ventured toward the village. What he found was ... nothing. Not destroyed, not abandoned, gone, no ruins, no smoke, no signs of evacuation. Just an empty clearing where homes, wells, fences, and pathways should have been. The earth was smooth, the grass fresh as if the village had never existed. But Georgi knew it had. He had traded goods with the villagers just a few weeks before. He knew their faces, their dialect, the way they welcomed him with soup and hand-woven blankets. When he reported this to the local authorities, they dismissed him, said he must have gotten lost. But Georgi returned with others, and when they arrived, they too found only emptiness. Nothing but forest and clearing, no Valmer, no trace. Then, things got stranger. People in surrounding towns started reporting dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams. Dreams of a village buried underground, of chanting in a language they couldn't understand, of faces pressed against their windows at night. Even those who had never heard of Valmer began waking up in terror. One woman, a schoolteacher in Cluj, said she saw a pale child standing at the foot of her bed every night for a week. The child never spoke. It just stared, expressionless, until she woke up screaming. She sketched the child's face out of desperation to prove she wasn't crazy. When shown to some older villagers who had once known Valmer, they went pale. It was Andrea, boy from Valmer who had died years ago in a well accident. How could someone from a village that no longer existed appear in the dreams of strangers? That same month, a team of university researchers, they used satellite imagery, electromagnetic sensors, and even ground-penetrating radar. What they found beneath the surface horrified them. Roughly 10 meters below the forest floor, there was an entire grid of structures, homes, tunnels, and what looked like a chapel all buried in compacted soil. It was as if the earth had swallowed the village whole. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. The depth of the burial, the condition of the soil, and the lack of any surface disturbance suggested that this wasn't recent. According to their analysis, Valmer had been underground for at least 100 years. Yet Georgi and many others had visited the village only weeks before it vanished. Was Valmer ... out of sync with time? As the researchers prepared to excavate, several members of the team began experiencing hallucinations. One claimed to see people walking around the dig site at night, whispering prayers. Another ran screaming into the woods after claiming she saw her mother, who had died 5 years earlier, standing in the chapel doorway underground. The expedition was quickly shut down. The university quietly pulled funding. The site was sealed off. Then came the final twist. An old Manan archivist from a forgotten monastery in Transylvania came forward. He had heard whispers of Valmer in old texts. According to him, the village was founded by excommunicated monks in the 1500s, practitioners of an ancient forbidden rite meant to sever the soul from the body before death. They believed that by existing halfway between the physical and spiritual world, they could escape the final judgment. Their rituals involved burying themselves alive temporarily, practicing death as a form of transcendence. But over generations, something went wrong. The veil between their world and the afterlife began to tear. Creatures, entities crossed over. People disappeared. The monks panicked and sealed the village underground using their most powerful rite, the binding chant if true. Then the Valmer Georgi visited wasn't a living village. It was a relic, a phantom echo forced into temporary existence by a thinning of the veil. One final account comes from a backpacker in 2003, who claims she accidentally stumbled into Valmer while hiking. She described the village as silent and gray, like time had stopped. She saw no people but heard weeping behind closed doors. The chapel bell rang despite no wind. When she tried to take a photo with her digital camera, the device shut down and never turned back on. She ran, and when she looked back, the village had vanished, just like that. Today, Valmer is spoken of only in whispers. Maps avoid the area. Locals refuse to enter that part of the forest, and those who do, some never return. So the next time you walk deep into the woods and find yourself somewhere unfamiliar, ask yourself, is this a place that should exist? Or have you stepped into something ... forgotten by time? Because some villages don't disappear because of war, famine, or disaster. Some are erased because they were never supposed to be found. The waves crashed violently against the rusted hull of the Obsidian Dawn, once a mighty warship. It now drifted silently through the vast Atlantic like a tomb forgotten by time. As the fog thickened and the cold air pierced the skin like needles, the ship's secrets began to awaken, dark, ancient, and vengeful. They say no soul who has boarded the Obsidian Dawn has returned sane nor at all. But why? What curses lie beneath its corroded decks? What horrors whisper through the hollow corridors at night? It all began during World War II. The Obsidian Dawn was commissioned by the Allied forces, a destroyer-class vessel equipped with top-of-the-line radar and sonar systems. Its mission was clear: eliminate any enemy submarines in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. And for the first few months, it did just that efficiently, ruthlessly. But something changed on the night of June 14, 1943. Ship received a distress call from a nearby cargo vessel that had reported an unknown presence trailing them beneath the waves. As the Obsidian Dawn moved in to investigate, its systems began to fail. Radar readings became erratic, and crew members started complaining of intense headaches, hallucinations, and a deep sense of dread. Captain Marshall, a hardened veteran who had survived both the Pacific and European theaters, gave the order to press on. As the fog closed in, visibility dropped to near zero. The crew reported hearing voices, some claiming to hear their loved ones calling out from the water. Others said they heard chanting in a language no one could recognize. Then the screaming began. One by one, sailors vanished, not overboard, but inside the ship. They would walk into a corridor and simply never come out. Others were found wandering in circles, muttering nonsense and gouging at their own eyes. Something was clearly wrong. When the radio operator finally made contact with base, his message was chilling: "This ship is alive. We are not alone." The transmission cut off. In the weeks that followed, search crews found no trace of the Obsidian Dawn. It had vanished. Not sunk, not destroyed, just ... gone. No debris, no oil slicks, no emergency beacons. The US Navy declared the ship lost due to enemy engagement, but unofficially, they knew something else had happened. Years later, in 1967, a British fishing trawler picked up a distress signal in the North Atlantic. The crew followed the signal and stumbled upon the ship, still intact, floating aimlessly in international waters. Against their better judgment, 3 men boarded the vessel. Their accounts, recorded shortly after being rescued by a NATO patrol, paint a disturbing picture. It was freezing cold, like the ship had been sitting in the Arctic. There was no power, but lights flickered on and off. And the smell was like rotting meat and seaweed. We found the crew quarters, but they were covered in black mold. Like ... alive. Pulsating. One of the guys touched it and started convulsing. We heard footsteps, but there was no one there, and whispering followed us. 2 of the fishermen died within days, bleeding from their eyes and ears. The third was committed to a psychiatric hospital, where he spent the remainder of his life drawing spirals and diagrams on the walls, murmuring about the mouths in the water. Modern investigators speculate the Obsidian Dawn may have encountered some form of experimental weapon or environmental anomaly. But among paranormal research, that its exposure to the horrors of war and death created a spiritual echo or liminal space between life and the afterlife. There are chilling reports from satellite images capturing the ship in different locations across the globe, sometimes thousands of miles apart within hours. A drifting ghost, a sea phantom. Some say the Obsidian Dawn appears only to those who are close to death or those who've experienced unimaginable grief. A kind of beacon for lost souls. One crew of a merchant vessel claimed they encountered it after the suicide of a ship. They approached the strange silhouette in the fog and realized it was the missing destroyer. Before they could board it, vanished in front of their eyes, disintegrating into 1,000 shadowy birds. In 1999, a group of amateur explorers funded a private expedition to track down the Obsidian Dawn. They were never heard from again. All that was recovered was a single video camera, found floating in a waterproof case off the coast of Newfoundland. The footage is brief, shaky, and terrifying. The team boards the ship, joking nervously. One of them mentions how quiet everything is. A loud metallic bang is heard. The camera swings wildly. There are screams, and the feed cuts out with a final image showing a dark, distorted face behind a porthole, its eyes glowing faintly red. Experts who reviewed the footage claim it had not been tampered with, but the media buried the story. No major outlets reported on it. The video, once leaked online, was quickly taken down across all platforms. Today, maritime authorities deny the existence of the Obsidian Dawn, but sailors across the globe share hushed warnings about a black ship that drifts in and out of the mist. Some even wear talismans or carry relics to protect themselves at sea. In ghost ship folklore, few vessels are as feared as the Obsidian Dawn, not for what it is, but for what it attracts. It is said to feed on fear, to echo the deaths of all who step aboard. Some believe it collects souls, adding them to its eternal crew. There's a legend that if you hear your name whispered across the sea, and you see the outline of an old warship in the fog, don't respond, don't look closer, and whatever you do, don't board it. Because once you set foot on the Obsidian Dawn, you'll never leave. The sky over Millfield had turned an ominous gray by the time the van reached the outskirts of town. Wind whipped through the bare branches, and the decaying remains of an iron gate creaked in the gusts. Beyond the gate loomed a silhouette of Westvale Asylum, a sprawling, Gothic structure that had been abandoned for nearly half a century. Once a state-of-the-art psychiatric facility, Westvale had long been swallowed by mystery. Fires, suicides, patients who vanished without a trace. The institution had closed its doors in 1973, but the whispers never stopped. Rachel stood outside the rusted gate, her breath visible in the cold air. The building radiated dread even from a distance. "It looks like something out of a nightmare," she muttered. David tightened his jacket and flicked on his flashlight. "We're not here to admire the architecture. We're here to find answers." The team stepped through the broken gate. With every crunch of gravel underfoot, the asylum seemed to grow taller, darker, more alive. The doors to the asylum were unlocked. Not surprising, given that local legends claimed no one dared to approach. The air inside was stale and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and rot. Cracked linoleum tiles littered the floor like broken teeth. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. Their lights cut through the blackness, revealing doorways to treatment rooms, long-forgotten file cabinets, and what might have once been a front desk, now buried under layers of dust and rat droppings. "Keep an eye on the EMF meter," Rachel whispered. "There's something about this place. It's wrong." They moved slowly, room by room. In one, they found antique restraints bolted to beds. In another, walls scratched with desperate messages. Pleas for release, or maybe just evidence of madness. One phrase was repeated across several rooms. "They never let you asleep." In the eastern wing, David spotted a partially collapsed stairwell leading downward. A faded sign above the threshold read, "Archives. Authorized personnel only." The group hesitated. "That doesn't scream safe," Alex said, squinting into the shadows. "Exactly why we should go," Rachel replied. "If something was hidden, it would have been down here." They descended carefully, the staircase groaning with each step. At the bottom, they found a heavy metal door, its hinges rusted and warped. Rachel pushed with her shoulder until it gave way. Behind it was a narrow corridor, damp and pitch black, leading to a vast records hall. Shelves upon shelves of patient files, medical notes, and audio logs lined the room. Rachel's flashlight beam landed on an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, still loaded with a dusty reel. She pressed play. Static Dr. Arlen. Patient 413 shows signs of extreme paranoia. Claims he can hear voices in the walls. That the walls are alive. Static Dr. Arlen. Something is wrong in Ward C. The patients are seeing things. I'm seeing things. Ward C had always been the most restricted area of Westvale, reserved for the most violent, unstable patients. It had long been closed off from the rest of the asylum. The entrance was chained shut, but H had weakened the barrier. They slipped through. Immediately, the air grew colder. The EMF meter spiked. Whispers echoed from nowhere. The hallway was a twisted maze of collapsed ceilings and flickering lights. The team passed rusted gurneys and wheelchairs, overturned and broken like abandoned toys. At the end of the hall, they found a cell with claw marks gouged deep into stone walls. Far too deep for human fingernails. On the floor, written in dried blood, "They feed on our dreams." Alex gagged. "What happened to these people?" "Not what. Who?" Rachel whispered. "Their equipment began malfunctioning. Cameras died, batteries drained inexplicably, and then came the noises, dragging footsteps, not their own, metal scraping against walls, faint laughter echoing through empty rooms. At one point, David turned around, convinced he saw someone standing just behind them. A woman in a hospital gown, her eyes black and hollow. But when he blinked, she was gone. Then Rachel's voice cracked through the silence. Everyone stopped. "You hear that?" They listened, faint but real. A heartbeat. Not their own, thump and slow, heavy, coming from the floor beneath them. "And it's alive." They found a service elevator, its doors jammed open, revealing a rusted shaft that descended into pitch blackness. "There's no record of a level beneath Ward C," David said, checking the blueprints. "Exactly," Rachel replied. "Which means we have to see it." They lowered themselves down using the old maintenance ladder. When they reached the bottom, they stepped into something out of a nightmare. The walls were concrete, but covered in a black tar-like substance that pulsed faintly. The floor was wet, sticky. The smell was putrid, rot mixed with sulfur. Something had been living here, or still was. At the end of the hallway, they found a steel door with no handle, just a strange symbol carved into the surface, a spiral made of sharp lines and intersecting arrows. Rachel touched it. The door opened on its own. Inside, the walls were covered in hundreds of photographs, faces of patients, doctors, and people they didn't recognize. But all the eyes had been blacked out. In the center of the room was an ancient, crude altar. On it, a jar filled with something unidentifiable. Next to it, a file folder labeled simply Project Somnia. The file contained dozens of pages, medical diagrams, psychological evaluations. But the message was clear. Westvale hadn't been just a mental hospital. It was a government-funded research facility, experimenting with dream deprivation, sensory manipulation, and even induced hallucinations. They were attempting to weaponize the human subconscious. Patients were kept awake for days, even weeks, deprived of all external stimuli except the whispers, recorded voices fed through walls, until their minds fractured. But something went wrong. One patient, subject 9, didn't break. Instead, he began affecting the others. They claimed he was dreaming through them, that he was feeding on them, that he had become something else. His name had been redacted, but his photo was still in the file. Rachel stared at it in horror. "I've seen him upstairs, in the hallway." The group realized they weren't alone. Shadows moved in the corner of their vision. Voices called out in their own tones, perfectly mimicked. Rachel felt something brush her arm. Alex's flashlight exploded with a burst of sparks. Suddenly, every photograph on the wall began to bleed. Thick, black ooze dripping from eyeless sockets. And then, a deep, guttural voice echoed from every direction at once. "You find me?" They ran up the shaft, through the ward, past the chained doors and haunted hallways. The whispers turned into screams. Doors slammed behind them. Lights flickered violently. By the time they reached the van, the asylum was silent again, as if it had never awakened at all. Rachel stared back at the looming structure, now half swallowed in fog. "We weren't supposed to find that room," she whispered. "But now that we did, it knows us." Their footage, what survived, would reveal fragments, shadows, audio distortions, one still frame of a man standing in the doorway of Ward C smiling, eyes black as void. They had uncovered something ancient, and now it knows they're real. The days that followed their escape from Westvale were a blur of sleepless nights and constant dread. Rachel, David, and Alex had returned to their homes, but something had followed them, a presence they couldn't name, a feeling they couldn't shake. Even in the safety of daylight, shadows seemed to stretch too long. Mirrors distorted their reflections. Dreams turned violent, vivid, and unrelenting. Rachel documented everything. Her notes were frantic, scribbled in the margins of old case files, on napkins, even her own skin when she ran out of paper. Every dream she had was the same. She stood at the altar in the basement, surrounded by the whispering photographs, unable to move. Behind her always, the same voice. "We are awake now." Alex stopped responding to messages after 3 days. When David went to check on him, he found the front door ajar. Inside, the apartment was silent. All the windows were covered with bed sheets, taped shut. Every wall had been covered in drawings, spirals, eyes without pupils. The words "sleepless" repeated over and over again. In the center of the living room was Alex's camera, still recording. The footage showed Alex speaking to the lens, eyes wide, haunted. "They come in dreams, but they don't stay there anymore. I wake up and they're still here. I'm not sure which side is real anymore. I think..." He paused, looking off camera. "I think I'm not real anymore." Then he smiled, the same empty smile they had seen in the photo of Subject 9. David fled the apartment. That night, Rachel had her worst dream yet. She was back in the records room, but the shelves stretched forever. She walked for what felt like hours, until she reached a door marked with that same spiral. When she opened it, she saw not a room, but a mirror, and her own face was no longer hers. Her eyes were voids, her mouth sewn shut, and behind her, reaching out, was a figure wrapped in hospital sheets, mouth open in an eternal scream. She woke up screaming, bleeding from her nose. "Desperate," she called David. "We didn't just see something in Westvale. We let something out." They decided to go back. One last time. Returning to the asylum was like walking into a nightmare with eyes wide open. The front gate was gone, as if ripped off its hinges. The air was thicker, heavier, and not just with mold, with intention, like the building knew they were back. Inside, the asylum had changed. Hallways had shifted. Rooms they'd previously explored were gone or different. The graffiti was new. Messages they hadn't seen before. One said, "Welcome back, Rachel." Another, "The door is open." They made their way to Ward C. Only now the walls bled without touching. The lights flickered even without power. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Words felt dangerous here. The shaft of the basement was already open. They climbed down, flashlights flickering. The black substance was thicker now, pulsing, breathing. The altar room was waiting for them, untouched. But Rachel noticed something new. A second file, labeled Project Somnia Phase 2. Inside were documents written in fresh ink. "Dr. Harlan's Subject 9 has evolved. He is no longer one, he is many. He is the dream that survives Wick. We thought we were containing him, but we were feeding him." Rachel dropped the folder. "They never stopped the project," she said. "They just buried it and we dug it back up." The altar pulsed. A low hum filled the room, growing louder. David pointed at the wall. The photographs were changing, showing them images of Rachel screaming, David crying, Alex drawing spirals, all with their eyes blacked out. "We have to end this," Rachel said. We can't let it spread. She pulled out a lighter. They doused the altar in alcohol and old film reels. As the flames rose, the room began to shake. Screams erupted from the walls. The ooze writhed and curled away from the fire. But then, from behind them, a voice, so clear it felt like it was inside their skulls. Burn the altar. They ran again, but this time, the building didn't fight them. It guided them, doors opened, lights illuminated their path, until they burst out into the cold night air. Behind them, Westvale glowed with fire, not destruction, transformation. As they watched, the flames turned violet, and the structure itself seemed to breathe. One final exhale. Before going silent, Rachel dropped to her knees. "It's done," David whispered, but neither of them believed it, because even now, in the silence, they heard it. "We are awake now. And if you're hearing this story, maybe they're awake in your dreams too." Rachel hadn't slept in 2 days, not because she was afraid of the dreams that had stopped mattering a long time ago, but because she knew something had changed, not just in her, or in David, or Alex, wherever he was now. The change was everywhere. On the news, there were reports of mass shared hallucinations. In Ohio, a small town had been evacuated. A subway driver in New York City had crashed a train because, according to witnesses, he kept whispering. "It's behind the glass." He was found catatonic, muttering the same word over and over again. Rachel scoured the internet. Every conspiracy forum, every dark web lead, every psychological study ever made on sleep paralysis or night terrors. They all began to converge around the same names, Westvale Arlen, Subject 9. And now, her image had begun appearing in places she hadn't visited. A Reddit thread showed a blurry shot of her on a train in Tokyo. Someone else posted a TikTok showing a woman who looked exactly like her walking into a hospital in Berlin. Rachel had never left the country, but the worst part, none of the videos showed her face. All of them had it blurred or removed. David had grown silent again, not because he was afraid, but because he was listening. He said the dreams were getting louder, that the boundary between waking and sleeping had dissolved. "It's like breathing underwater," he said. "You think you're awake, but everything's muted, slower, unnatural." Rachel believed him. She had begun seeing people on the streets with no eyes. Not metaphorically, their faces would blur, just for a second, just out of the corner of her eye. When she turned to look directly, they were gone. Or standing perfectly still, mouths open, humming the same low tone they heard at the altar. She carried the Project Somnia folder everywhere now. The Phase 2 documents had grown. More pages had appeared since the fire. New entries in Arlen's handwriting, except Dr. Arlen had been dead since 1998. Rachel verified that through public records. Still, every night, a new page appeared in the folder, and the ink was always fresh. One entry read, "The dream is no longer an intrusion. It is the substrate. What we perceive as reality is only an echo. We awakened the origin, and now we must become part of it." Phase 3 begins when awareness collapses. When the observer becomes observed. Rachel didn't know what Phase 3 was, but she feared it had already started. She and David met one final time. Neutral ground, an abandoned church outside of town. No mirrors, no photographs, just candles and silence. Both of them looked older than they should, worn hollow-eyed. "We made a mistake," David said, barely above a whisper. "We tried to fight it with fire, but this isn't something you burn. It's not physical, it's viral." Rachel nodded. "It spreads through memory, through stories, through attention." They stared at each other for a long time. "We're carriers," she finally said. David looked down at the floor. "Then we have to isolate the infection." That night, they made a pact. They would disappear, delete their online presence, destroy every file, every note, every copy of the footage. Even the whispers had to be silenced. But something fought back. Rachel's phone wouldn't reset. Every time she tried to wipe it, it played the same recording. Alex's voice. "It's not just in your head. It is your head." Her laptop began to type on its own. One line, "Project Somnia, you are Phase 3. Rachel smashed the screen. David burned his apartment. When firefighters arrived, there were no flames, but his walls were covered not in smoke or soot, but in photos of people sleeping. Hundreds, thousands, none of them recognizable, all of them watching. And each image bore a spiral. They went dark after that. Rachel lived off-grid, in a cabin with no power, no mirrors, no glass, just notebooks and silence. She didn't dream anymore, but she heard the dreams, a hum in the floorboards, a whisper in the wind. Sometimes, she'll wake up to find new words written in her handwriting, except she hadn't written them. One said, "The dream remembers." Another, "You never left Westvale." Rachel didn't believe it. Until the morning she woke up in a hospital bed. The room was clean, fluorescent lights above, her wrists strapped to the rails. A figure stood by the door. "Dr. Arlen," she whispered. He smiled. "Welcome back, Subject 13. Rachel screamed, but no sound came out, because in the mirror on the wall she saw her reflection, with black eyes and a sewn mouth. And on the table beside her, a folder labeled, Project Somnia Phase 4. So if you made it this far, I have a question for you. Have you been dreaming differently? Because if you remember any part of the story when you go to sleep tonight, the names, the whispers, the spiral, then you're already part of it. This story isn't just fiction. It's a virus, one you just invited into your mind. Sleep well.